Hello, welcome to my new shop. So here we are. It's 6 months later. I have a mustache and a perfectly functional workshop. I was going to make a video as I set up the workshop to sort of bring you along on the journey, but if you've ever made a video, you know that it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort, and life just got in the way for me. What I can share with you are some tips and tricks that I kept in mind as I was setting up the workshop, and hopefully inspire some organization techniques for you. Keep in mind that everything I share with you in this video is going to be a reflection of my personal preference. There are infinite ways to set up a workshop. This is just how I set up mine with the small space that I have. And of course, these techniques can be employed in a larger shop as well. The first thing I did before moving into the new shop was make a model of the space. When we first toured the house, I was able to make some measurements of the shop, and then I took those measurements into Adobe Illustrator and made a rough floor plan. Then I measured some of my bigger tools and put those into the model as well. This allowed me to make a rough setup of the shop and figure out the best arrangement for my tools. And I'd like to point out that you do not need any sort of fancy programs like Adobe Illustrator or SketchUp to get this step done. When I was a kid, before we'd rearrange a room in our house, we would cut out tiny pieces of paper to represent the furniture and move those around a drawing on graph paper. And while this seems silly, it got the job done and it saved us a bunch of time and work. So I highly recommend make a model before you start. The next thing I consider when I'm setting up shop, or even when I'm doing my model, is workflow. Does a tool need to go in a certain spot? What's going to be the best arrangement for my tools to make the making process as smooth as possible? When I'm doing metal work and welding, I typically like to have the garage door open for ventilation, so I put all those tools next to the garage door. My table saw is going to get used on every single project, so it makes sense to have it in the middle of my shop. From the table saw, things are going to move over to the workbench, where they'll be machined, assembled, finished, whatever. So it makes sense to have the workbench right next to the table saw. The same rule applies to smaller things. Clamps. I use them when assembling, so it makes sense to have them at arm's reach from the workbench. On the other end of the spectrum, Scotch-Brite pads. I don't use them very often, so it makes sense that these can get buried a little bit. And if you're new to making and aren't as familiar with your workflow, that's okay. Everyone's setup is going to change over time, and this leads me to my next point. Modularity. What this means is to make things changeable. I am constantly learning new techniques, buying new tools, and getting into new categories of making. So it makes sense that my shop layout might change over time. And as long as I set myself up to be adaptable to this, I won't run into any big issues. You'll notice that I have a lot of 2x materials mounted on the wall. This was partly an aesthetic choice, but it was mostly so that I can easily rearrange things that I have on the wall. As I use up or buy new material, I can easily add and subtract shelves with just a few screws. Now, it also helps to have certain tools on wheels. When I start a project that is primarily metalwork, I can easily roll the outfeed table and the table saw out of the way to make room for the welding table and the horizontal bandsaw. An example of some future expansion would be the area above the welding table. I may one day decide to hang a pegboard style tool wall here, and should I decide to, it's just as easy as cutting a board and screwing it into the exposed studs. Next up is put like things with like things. This one is self-explanatory, but it's very important. For example, I have a drawer that's dedicated to all things drilling. All of my hardware and consumables are in one cabinet. I have all of my hand tools in one area. Wrenches are with wrenches. You get the point. There is one other thing to consider that trumps all other tips and tricks I have mentioned so far, and that is space. If something doesn't fit, it can't go there. I don't have a material rack in this shop, and that is on purpose. I had one in my last two shops, and it was great. I had all of my building materials in one spot. But when I did my model, I found that I was not going to have space for one in this shop. So I improvised. I found every dead space and turned it into storage. I store things above my garage door, in between the wall and the garage door rail. I built shelves around the gas meter. I found that this weird ceiling space is great for longboard storage. Just a few weeks ago, I realized I could put a shelf above this dust pipe. Every space must be used. There are a few bonus topics that I'd like to talk about on this video, and the first up is lighting. Now, this is entirely personal preference, so there's only a couple universal things that I can really recommend. The first up being have a lot of lighting. You'll be able to see your marks better. It just makes the shop more fun to work in. It's just all around a better idea to have more light than less light. The second thing is make your lights adjustable. A couple of years ago, I made these brackets, and while most of the time I leave my lights where they are, it is nice to have the option to move them when I need to. The second bonus topic I want to bring up is ergonomics. Again, this is entirely personal preference, but it is something you should consider. You don't want your work surfaces so low that you hurt your back, or too high that your arms get tired. I personally like my work surfaces at about 36 to 38 inches tall, and so I try to build my furniture to reflect that. The last thing I want to bring up in the video is the question, is there stuff in the shop that can go somewhere else? I have a central dust collection system that I was lucky enough to fit outside the shop and pipe it in through a wall. I also have a couple bins that I keep in the basement right next to the shop. And as I start my next few projects, I'm going to be looking for things that can leave the shop and free up some of that precious space. Well, hi Onyx. That about wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it and hopefully you learned something. If you did, leave it down below in the comments. As I said in the beginning, everyone's going to set up their shop differently. If you're new to making and are looking to just get started and aren't really sure how, my best words of encouragement are to just start. You will learn what works and doesn't work for you as you go. Thanks everyone for watching. I will see you on the next one.